6 months ago, Celeste Vaughn fired Ryan Hale in front of the entire executive board, without blinking. She called him replaceable. She called him a liability. She said a man unwilling to sacrifice everything had no place in her world. Today, Vaughn Capital is gone. Accounts frozen. Board dissolved her name, buried under fraud headlines she didn't write. Celeste sits alone in a motel room that smells like mildew and defeat, with nothing left to her name. Then the door knocks. She opens it. Ryan Hale is standing there, holding a blank check. Vaughn Capital occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, and for 11 years, those floors belonged to Celeste Vaughn, the way a kingdom belongs to whoever built it from nothing. She had started with a single algorithm, a borrowed office, and a reputation she manufactured through sheer refusal to lose. By the time she was 38, her name appeared on the covers of 3 national business magazines in the same calendar year. She did not celebrate. Celebration was something people did when they were surprised by their own success, and Celeste had never been surprised by anything she earned. The company she ran managed over $4 billion in assets across technology and emerging markets. Every investment decision passed through her desk. Every partnership required her signature, every quarter. She delivered results that made her board smile and her competitors go quiet. She built Vaughn Capital on a single philosophy: emotion clouds judgment, and judgment is everything. She said it in interviews. She said it to new hires on their first day. She believed it the way some people believe in gravity, not because it felt true, but because she had never seen evidence to the contrary. Not yet. Ryan Hale had been with the company for 4 years when the trouble started. He ran the Strategic Analysis Division, a team of 9 people responsible for evaluating long-term risk in every major deal Vaughn Capital considered. He was good at the job in the quiet, thorough way that makes certain people invisible to their superiors and indispensable to everyone else. His colleagues knew that if a model had a flaw, Ryan would find it. His reports were clean and precise, and he never buried bad news in optimistic language to protect anyone's feelings, including Celeste's. She had always appreciated that about him, in the way she appreciated a well-calibrated instrument. Useful. Reliable. Nothing more. What she had never appreciated was how he left every day at 5:30. Not because he was careless or disengaged, but because he had a life outside those glass walls that he refused to dismantle for anyone. He didn't explain himself, didn't make excuses, and didn't ask permission. He simply finished what needed to be finished, handed off what needed to be handed off, and walked out. Celeste had noticed it for years and said nothing, because the work was always done and the results were always there. But she noticed, and in her private ledger of people she did not fully trust, his name sat in a column marked insufficient commitment. The Meridian deal changed everything. It was the largest acquisition Vaughn Capital had ever attempted, a $47 million stake in a data infrastructure company that would have tripled their market position in less than 3 years if it landed correctly. Celeste had been chasing it for 8 months. The final push required 6 weeks of round-the-clock due diligence, and she sent a company-wide directive making her expectations clear: nights, weekends, full availability until the deal closed. No one pushed back, no one except Ryan. He came to her office on a Tuesday morning, closed the door behind him, and told her that he would deliver everything the deal required during standard hours and would be available by phone for urgent matters, but that he would not be physically present past 8 in the evening on weekdays or at all on weekends. He said it without apology and without aggression. He said it the way a person states a fact they have already made peace with. Celeste looked at him across her desk for a long moment, and what she felt was not anger, not yet. What she felt first was confusion, the genuine kind, because she could not understand how a person could stand in front of her and speak those words as though they were reasonable. She told him she would consider his request. She did not consider it. What she did instead was spend the next 48 hours watching the rest of her team push past their limits, without complaint, watching junior analysts sleep on office couches and skip meals, watching people sacrifice things she never asked them to name. And she decided that Ryan Hale's refusal was not a personal accommodation request. It was a statement about values, and his values were incompatible with hers. The meeting where she fired him was a Thursday morning. The full executive leadership team was present, 12 people arranged around a table that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The agenda listed 3 items. Ryan's termination was not one of them. Celeste brought it up at the end, after the Meridian timeline update, after the risk review, after everything else had been handled, and everyone was already gathering their folders to leave. She did it that way deliberately. She wanted him to understand that this was not a difficult decision for her, that it had no weight. She looked at Ryan across the table and said without raising her voice, "A person unwilling to sacrifice everything will never belong in my world. Effective immediately, your position at Vaughn Capital is terminated." She slid a separation agreement across the table before he could respond. Human Resources had prepared it the night before. Ryan looked at the document, then at her, and then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the room without saying a word. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He didn't look back. And that more than anything was what stayed with Celeste in the months that followed. Not guilt, not doubt, but a faint, unplaceable irritation at how cleanly he had left. The Meridian deal closed 6 weeks later. Celeste stood at the podium of a company-wide celebration and told her team they had done the impossible. She believed it. For approximately 4 months, every indicator confirmed she was right. And then quietly, at first, things began to unravel. The first sign was a series of internal transactions that didn't match the audit trail. Celeste flagged them herself and handed the matter to the compliance team. What came back was a story she had not been prepared for. Leonard Grayson, her chief advisor, the man who had sat on her board for 6 years, who had helped her structure the Meridian deal from the beginning, had been working against her for at least 18 months. He had built a coalition of 4 board members who held enough combined voting authority to call an emergency governance review. He had also, somewhere in the process, begun quietly redirecting critical components of the firm's core investment algorithm, the proprietary model Celeste had designed herself, into a new entity registered under a shell company he controlled. She confronted the board on a Monday. By Thursday, her access credentials had been revoked. By the following Tuesday, the accounts were frozen, pending a regulatory inquiry that Leonard's team had apparently been seeding for months with selective documentation. The penthouse she owned outright was tied up in a civil asset claim her lawyers said could take 2 years to resolve. Vaughn Capital's public profile collapsed within 72 hours. The story ran in every major financial outlet. Female CEO ousted amid fraud investigation. The investigation was about Leonard, but the headline was about Celeste because her name was on the building. She called 6 people the night it happened. 3 did not answer. 2 answered and offered sympathy in the practiced, careful way that people offer sympathy when they have already decided they want nothing to do with the situation. The 6th, a woman who had been her closest professional contact for nearly a decade, listened for 30 seconds, and then said she thought it would be best for both of them if they kept their distance until the legal situation was clearer. Celeste thanked her and hung up. She sat in her car in the parking garage of a building she could no longer enter and understood for the first time in her adult life what it meant to have built everything and kept nothing. The motel was called the Eastfield Inn. It sat between a tire shop and a laundromat on a street that the financial district's glass towers never looked at. Room 14 cost $79 a night. Celeste paid in cash because her primary cards were frozen, and she was unwilling to use the emergency account her attorney had managed to preserve. Not because she was careful with money, but because spending that money felt like confirming that this was real. The room had a window that faced a brick wall, a television that only received 4 channels, and a smell that no amount of air freshener could fully cover. She had been there for 11 days. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark most nights, not because she was dramatic about it, but because turning on the light required an energy she couldn't locate. She had spent her entire career making decisions in the absence of fear. She had woken up every morning knowing exactly what she was building and why. Now she woke up, and the first thought that arrived wasn't a plan. It was a question she had no answer to. Who was she if she wasn't this? The empire was gone. The board was gone. The people she had believed were loyal were gone. And in their absence, she found not freedom, but a silence so complete it was almost a physical thing. It was 11:47 at night on a Wednesday when someone knocked on the door of room 14. Celeste did not move immediately. She assumed it was the motel manager following up on something administrative, and she was not in the condition to deal with administrative anything. The knock came again, not aggressive, not uncertain. Measured. She pulled on the jacket hanging over the chair by the door and opened it. Ryan Hale was standing in the hallway under a fluorescent light that buzzed faintly above his head. He was wearing a dark gray coat and looked exactly as he always had, composed, unhurried, present in the particular way that had always read to Celeste as either great patience or great indifference, and she had never bothered to determine which. In his right hand, he held a plain white envelope. He held it out to her without preamble. Celeste stared at him. Her first instinct, immediate and visceral, was that this was what cruelty looked like in its most refined form, that he had come here to this specific room on this specific night to watch her receive it. She had fired him in front of 12 people. She had called him replaceable, and now he was standing in the doorway of the worst place she had ever lived, holding something she didn't want to touch. She did not take the envelope. Ryan set it on the small table just inside the door without waiting for her to accept it. He looked at her directly and said, "Write the number you need. I want to help you save your company." The envelope contained a single item, a blank check signed at the bottom in his name with every other field left empty. Celeste looked at the check, then at him, and felt something she had not expected. Not gratitude, not relief, but a disorientation so complete it was almost dizzying. She had a framework for every human interaction she had ever encountered. People helped when they expected something. People offered when they wanted leverage. People showed up at midnight when they wanted to witness the fall. Not one category she possessed could explain what Ryan Hale was doing in this hallway. She had ended his career without hesitation. She had not thought about him once in the 6 months since, and he had come here anyway, with a blank check and no conditions she could see. She looked at him and asked the only question she had. "Why?" It came out quieter than she intended, not soft, but stripped. The way a voice sounds when all its professional architecture has been removed, and there is only the actual person left underneath. Ryan met her eyes and held them steady before he answered. He said, "Because I know what it feels like when the whole world decides you're done." She did not take the check that night. She let Ryan leave it on the table and stood in the doorway watching him walk back down the hallway, without turning around, without waiting for her answer, without making her feel the weight of what he'd offered. She closed the door, sat back down on the edge of the bed, and looked at the envelope from across the room, the way you look at something you're not sure is safe to touch. Outside, a truck rolled past on the wet street, and the fluorescent light above the bathroom mirror hummed its single flat note. The check sat there all night, unsigned and untouched. By morning, Celeste had constructed a theory she could live with. Ryan Hale was not here out of generosity. He was here because watching Celeste Vaughn accept his money, Celeste Vaughn, who had fired him in front of 12 executives without losing a breath, would be the most complete form of satisfaction available to a man in his position. She had spent 11 years reading people's motives before they finished their sentences, and she was not about to stop now just because she was sitting in a $79 motel room with nowhere to be. She tucked the envelope under the corner of the mattress and did not think about it again. Or she tried not to. Ryan came back the next evening. He knocked twice, the same measured knock as before, and when she opened the door, he was holding 2 coffees in paper cups. He handed her one without asking if she wanted. It walked past her to the room's single chair and sat down. He didn't mention the check. He didn't ask what she'd decided. He just drank his coffee and told her matter-of-factly that he'd been where she was, not in terms of money or companies, but in terms of the feeling. The specific feeling of realizing that the structure you built your entire life around had evaporated and taken everyone standing on it with them. He described it without self-pity, the way someone describes weather they passed through a long time ago, accurately, but without drama. Celeste leaned against the wall with her arms crossed and said she didn't need his empathy. Ryan said he wasn't offering empathy. He was offering an observation. There was a difference. She almost smiled at that, and she hated herself for it, so she turned toward the window and looked at the brick wall instead. Ryan finished his coffee, set the cup on the table, and left. He did not push. He did not press. He simply came, said what he had to say, and removed himself from her space before she could build a full argument against him. She stood at the closed door for a moment after he left, aware that she had not, in fact, built a full argument against him. He came back the day after that, and the day after that. He never stayed more than 40 minutes. He never brought up the check again. What he brought instead were small, practical things: coffee, occasionally food from a diner down the street, once a folder of publicly available financial documents she hadn't thought to look for herself. He didn't explain why he was doing it. He didn't ask her to acknowledge it. And this, his complete absence of agenda signaling, was the thing Celeste could not categorize, and therefore could not dismiss. On the 5th evening, she asked him point blank what he had built since leaving Vaughn Capital. It wasn't a concession. It was reconnaissance. She needed to understand who she was actually dealing with. Ryan told her about the firm he'd started, a financial analysis consultancy that served mid-sized companies who couldn't afford the big houses but needed serious risk modeling. He'd started it with 4 people. He now had 19. The revenues were not large by Vaughn Capital standards, but the margins were clean, the clients were loyal, and the operation ran on what he called an honest structure, meaning nobody worked themselves into the ground to manufacture a number that looked impressive on a quarterly deck. He described it the way someone describes a thing they built, because they wanted it to exist, not because they wanted people to admire them for it. Celeste listened without interrupting, which was not something she did often, and when he finished, she told him the truth that she had always considered his kind of operation a smaller ambition, a lesser version of what a person with real capability could achieve. Ryan nodded and said he knew that was what she thought. Then he said something that lodged itself in a part of her she didn't have a name for. He said, "I don't want to help you rebuild Vaughn Capital. That company was a machine that ran on people's fear of disappointing you. What I want to help you figure out is what you actually want to build when that's not the goal anymore." It was the first time in recent memory that someone had said something to Celeste Vaughn that she had no prepared response to. She told him she would think about it. She didn't sleep that night, but not because of despair, because she was actually thinking. 2 weeks after Ryan's first appearance at the motel, Celeste agreed to let him show her what he'd found. Not the blank check that still hadn't moved from under the mattress, but the documentation. Ryan had not been idle in the months since leaving Vaughn Capital. He had kept track of Vaughn's public filings, the way analysts keep track of things they once worked on, out of professional habit and residual respect for the craft. What he'd noticed, buried in the Meridian deal's post-closing disclosures, was a series of intellectual property transfer clauses that no one on the outside would flag as unusual unless they knew exactly what the original algorithm architecture looked like. Ryan knew. He had worked alongside it for 4 years. They spread the documents across the small table in his car because the motel room didn't have enough surface space, and Celeste refused to meet anywhere that required her to be seen in public. Ryan walked her through the chain of transfers the shell company registered in Delaware 3 months before the board vote, the licensing agreement buried in a subsidiary's filing. The way Leonard Grayson's name appeared nowhere directly, but surfaced twice through intermediary signatories that Ryan had cross-referenced against public corporate records. It was meticulous patient work, and it told a story that Celeste already knew in her gut, but had never seen mapped out this cleanly. Leonard had not acted in a moment of opportunism. He had planned this for over a year and a half. The board hadn't rebelled. They had been recruited. Celeste sat with that for a long time. The algorithm he had taken, the one she had spent 3 years building before she ever had a company large enough to use it, was not just a tool. It was the intellectual core of everything Vaughn Capital had ever been. Without it, she had no claim to having built anything that couldn't be replicated. With it in Leonard's hands registered under his entity, she had no legal foundation to stand on without a fight that would take years and every dollar she had left. She looked at Ryan and said they needed to find the original development records. Internal files, time-stamped code repositories, server logs from the early years. Ryan said he knew someone who might still have access to the backup architecture from the firm's first infrastructure, built out a former IT contractor who had never formally been off-boarded when the company switched systems. Celeste started to tell him exactly how to approach that conversation, exactly what to ask for, and in what order, and Ryan looked at her without expression and said, "I'll handle it." She stopped. She recognized what was happening. She was doing the thing she always did, which was assume that her way of handling something was the only competent way. She closed her mouth and said, "Okay." That single word cost her more than she expected. Ryan also brought in Diane Mercer, around this time, a corporate fraud attorney he had worked with briefly during a client dispute the previous year. Diane was methodical and unsentimental, in equal measure the kind of lawyer who asked exactly the question she needed to, and none she didn't. She met with Celeste twice in the first week, both times, in a conference room at the back of a building that belonged to Diane's firm, and had no connection to anyone involved in the Vaughn Capital situation. Diane reviewed the documentation Ryan had assembled and told Celeste plainly that what they had was a foundation, not a case. It pointed clearly toward fraud, but pointing and proving were different instruments, and they would need the original development records to close the gap. Celeste told her they were working on it. Diane said to work faster. The weeks that followed had their own particular difficulty. Celeste and Ryan moved carefully, no direct communications through traceable channels, no meetings in places with cameras that could be pulled, no names attached to any written request that could surface in a legal proceeding. Celeste contributed what she knew from the inside, the governance procedures Leonard would have had to circumvent the specific vote thresholds required for the kind of board action he had engineered, the paper trail that should have existed and didn't. For the first time in her professional life, she was working with someone rather than directing them, and the friction of it was constant and quiet, and sometimes nearly unbearable. There were moments where she caught herself issuing instructions and had to step back from them. Moments where Ryan made a decision she would have made differently, and she held the disagreement in her chest and said nothing. And it was fine. The outcome was fine, and she had to sit with the discomfort of that. What made it harder was that every time Ryan did something patient or methodical or quietly effective on her behalf, the weight of what she had done to him became more specific. She had not thought of it as cruelty at the time. She had thought of it as standards. Now, watching him spend his own capital, financial and otherwise, on a problem she had created entirely without his input, she found that the word standards no longer did the work she needed it to do. She didn't bring any of this up. She kept moving because movement was what she knew how to do when the alternative was sitting with something she wasn't ready to examine fully. Leonard, in the meantime, had not been passive. 2 weeks into their investigation, a story appeared in a financial trade publication sourced anonymously, suggesting that Celeste had been aware of the irregularities at Vaughn Capital long before the regulatory inquiry began and had attempted to conceal them through a restructuring she had personally authorized. The story was constructed from real events, arranged in a sequence that produced a false conclusion. Celeste's attorney called it aggressive but not unexpected. Celeste recognized it immediately as Leonard's handwriting, not because she could prove it, but because she knew how he thought. He was not trying to win in court. He was trying to make her disappear from the industry entirely before she could mount any kind of public response. 3 days after the article ran, Ryan received a letter from a law firm she didn't recognize, raising questions about the consulting contracts his firm had signed with 2 clients who had previously worked with Vaughn Capital. The questions were vague enough to be impossible to answer directly and specific enough to require a response. It was a signal, not a lawsuit. Leonard, or someone working for him, had figured out that Ryan was involved, and now they were making clear that Ryan's exposure was on the table. Celeste read the letter in Ryan's car outside a parking structure on a Tuesday afternoon. She read it twice. Then she set it on the console between them and looked straight ahead through the windshield at the concrete pillar in front of them. Ryan was watching her, not the letter. He had already read it. She found the critical documentation 2 days later, a set of original server logs that the IT contractor had preserved on a personal backup drive, never transferred to the company's main architecture when the system switched. The logs contained time-stamped records of the algorithm's development history, going back 7 years with Celeste's credentials attached to every meaningful entry. Diane reviewed the materials within 24 hours and told them this changed the picture substantially. Paired with the shell company filings and the IP transfer chain Ryan had already mapped, it was enough to give the legal team a real foundation, enough to trigger a serious independent audit, enough to make Leonard's position genuinely precarious if it reached the right hands. Celeste sat in Ryan's office, a quiet, functional room in a building that smelled like coffee and reasonable expectations, and looked at the folder in front of her. She knew exactly what the next step was. The instinct was automatic. Take what you have, move fast. Make it public before the other side has time to respond. Every version of Celeste Vaughn that had ever existed in a boardroom or a courtroom or a negotiation knew how this moment was supposed to go, but Ryan's law firm letter was still sitting on her desk at the motel. And she knew, not as a calculation, but as a clear, direct fact, that if she moved on this evidence now, the collateral damage would fall on him. His firm's contracts would be scrutinized. His new clients would receive calls. The story would no longer be Celeste Vaughn versus Leonard Grayson. It would also be Ryan Hale, and Ryan Hale had nothing to do with any of the decisions that had led them here. He had simply made the inexplicable choice to help someone who had given him no reason to. She closed the folder. She did not reach for her phone. She sat in that office in the quiet of a place built on something real, and she let herself understand what she was choosing and why. It was the first decision she had made in years that had nothing to do with winning. It felt like putting something down that she hadn't realized she was still carrying until the moment her hands were empty. Ryan came back into the room and looked at the closed folder on the desk. He looked at her face. He didn't ask. Celeste met his eyes and said, "I'm not using it. Not like this." Ryan stood in the doorway for a moment, reading her, the way he had always read situations carefully, without rushing to fill the space. Then he nodded, once pulled a chair out across the desk from her, and sat down. Neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence between them was for the first time something other than uncomfortable. It was just 2 people sitting in a room where something important had just quietly happened. In the days after she closed the folder, Celeste moved out of the Eastfield Inn, not because her financial situation had materially improved. The accounts were still frozen, the legal proceedings still grinding through their slow institutional machinery, but because Ryan had pointed out, without making a production of it, that she had access to the emergency fund her attorney had preserved, and that using it to live in a slightly less punishing environment was not surrender. It was basic operational sense. She rented a furnished studio apartment on the 4th floor of a building that was neither impressive nor humiliating, and she sat in it most mornings, with coffee she made herself, and thought about things she had not previously allowed herself time to think about. The most persistent of these thoughts was not about Leonard, or the algorithm, or what the regulatory inquiry might eventually produce. It was about the people she had managed across 11 years of building Vaughn Capital, and what she now understood about what her management had actually cost them. She had always told herself that demanding excellence was a form of respect, that she held her team to a high standard because she believed they were capable of meeting it. This had felt true for a long time. Now, in the particular silence of a furnished apartment, with no agenda and no performance to maintain, she found herself revisiting specific moments. The analyst who had cried in the bathroom during the Meridian push and apologized to her supervisor for it, as though emotion in the face of exhaustion were a professional failing. The senior associate who had missed his father's surgery because Celeste had scheduled a mandatory review that same afternoon, and no one had felt they could ask to reschedule. She had known about these things at the time, and had filed them under the necessary costs of building something significant. That filing system no longer held. She was not spiraling. She was not collapsing under guilt in any dramatic sense. She was simply for the first time letting herself look directly at what she had built and what it had required from people who had not signed up to give that much. It was a quiet reckoning, the kind that doesn't announce itself with a breakdown or a revelation, but simply accumulates until the weight of it becomes undeniable. Ryan came by the apartment on a Thursday evening, and she told him. Not all of it, not the specific memories, not the names, but the core of it, which was that she no longer wanted to be the version of herself that had run Vaughn Capital. She said it plainly, without framing it as a confession or performing contrition. She said, "I don't want to win the way I used to win. I'm not sure I can explain that better than that right now." Ryan listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said something that was less comforting and more accurate than comfort. "You don't have to explain it better. You just have to mean it." She told him she thought she did. He told her that was enough for now. Before he left that evening, Celeste crossed the room to where her bag sat on the kitchen counter. She pulled out the envelope, the same plain white envelope he had placed on the table of room 14 weeks earlier, and held it out to him. The check was still inside, still blank, still signed only at the bottom with his name. She hadn't written a number. She hadn't intended to. Ryan took the envelope without comment and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction, something quieter than either of those the way a person looks when something they hoped for but didn't expect actually comes true. He nodded once and walked out. She stood in the kitchen of her rented studio and felt unexpectedly lighter. 2 weeks later, Leonard Grayson's situation changed without Celeste's intervention. A former mid-level compliance officer at one of the board members' affiliated funds, a man named Walter Briggs, who had nothing to do with Celeste and no particular loyalty to anyone in the situation, had filed a whistleblower report with the Securities and Exchange Commission 5 months earlier, flagging a pattern of document manipulation he had witnessed firsthand during the period surrounding the Meridian deal. The report had moved through the system at the pace these things move, which is to say slowly and without announcement. By the time it surfaced publicly, it had accumulated supporting material from 2 separate regulatory bodies and a state attorney general's office that had been running a parallel inquiry into the same shell company network Ryan had mapped in his own research. The documentation Diane had secured sat in a separate filing. Her office had submitted through proper legal channels, and it had quietly reinforced the regulator's existing picture without Celeste ever having to go public herself. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, Not in a financial trade publication, but in the national press. Leonard's name was in the headline. The board members who had voted to remove Celeste were named in the regulatory filing as persons of interest. Celeste read the story on her phone at her kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside her. She waited for the surge of satisfaction she would have expected from herself, the clean, cold pleasure of watching someone who had wronged her get precisely what they deserved. It didn't come. What she felt instead was something quieter and harder to name. Something adjacent to relief, but not about herself. Relief that it had happened through a process she hadn't contaminated. That Walter Briggs, a man she had never met, had done the right thing at personal risk without asking anything in return, and that his action had produced a consequence more thorough than anything she could have manufactured on her own. She thought about what Ryan had said to her weeks earlier, that she didn't need to win this by herself, and understood now that she had not. She also understood that this was not a diminishment. It was simply how justice sometimes worked, which was through other people acting with integrity in places you couldn't see. She called Ryan that morning and told him what she'd read. He already knew. He said, "How do you feel?" It was a simple question, and she noticed that she didn't feel the usual impulse to deflect it or reframe it into something more manageable. She said, "Like I can start." Ryan said, "Then let's start." What they built was not large. That was the first thing Celeste had to make peace with, and it was harder than she anticipated, not because she was unwilling, but because smallness felt unnatural to her in a way that went deeper than ego. She had spent so many years equating scale with validity that operating without it felt like working in a language she was only beginning to learn. Ryan helped her establish a financial advisory firm with a narrow focus, distressed companies in the mid-market looking for honest risk assessment and turnaround strategy. Not a fund, not an empire. A firm of 12 people with a structure built around the principle that good work was possible without destroying the people doing it. Diane helped them structure the entity, cleanly reviewed every founding document herself, and told Celeste during one of their early meetings that she had seen a lot of people try to rebuild after something like this, and that the ones who built something real were the ones who stopped trying to prove something in the process. Celeste wrote that down and did not show it to anyone. She hired carefully and slowly, which was also new. She interviewed every candidate herself, not to find the ones willing to sacrifice the most, but to find the ones who were genuinely good at the work and had enough self-possession to tell her when they thought she was wrong. She found this criterion harder to screen for than she expected, partly because the type of person she had always attracted, ambitious, hungry, eager to earn her approval, was precisely the type she was now trying to avoid. Ryan sat in on 2 of the early interviews, not to evaluate candidates, but to watch her, and afterward, he told her she was doing better than she thought. She asked him how he could tell. He said, "You asked them what they thought, and then you listened." The first month was uncomfortable in ways she could not have predicted. She was not good at collaboration, she knew this, but she had believed the gap was bridgeable through simple discipline. What she discovered was that collaboration required something more specific than effort. It required genuine tolerance for uncertainty for processes that moved more slowly because multiple people were contributing to them, for outcomes that were sometimes good, but different from what she would have produced alone. There were days when she went home and sat with the particular frustration of having been in a room with 11 capable people and felt against all evidence that it would have been faster to do it herself. She did not act on this feeling. She sat with it instead, and it became over weeks slightly less acute. She brought Ryan coffee on a Wednesday morning, the way he had brought her coffee in those early weeks at the Eastfield Inn. She set it on his desk. He kept a small office adjacent to hers, a consulting arrangement they had formalized with a contract that Diane had drawn up, and both of them had signed without ceremony, and stood in the doorway with her own cup. She had been thinking about what she wanted to say for several days, Not the words exactly, but the nature of them, which was that she wanted them to be honest rather than polished. She waited until he looked up from his screen. She told him she was sorry. Not for what had happened to her, and not as a prologue to something else. She said it directly, that firing him the way she had in front of that room full of people was something she had done because she had the power to do it, and because she had not been in the habit of thinking past her own definitions of what people were worth. She said she had told herself it was about professional standards, but that was not entirely true, and she understood that now. The truth was simpler and worse. She had not believed that how she treated people mattered as long as the results were right. Ryan Hale's results had always been right. She had fired him anyway because he had refused to let the company consume him, and she had experienced that refusal as a judgment on the way she lived, and she had not been able to tolerate it. Ryan let her finish. He did not rush to reassure her, and he did not perform forgiveness, and she was grateful for both of these things because she had not come to him looking for absolution. She had come because it was the honest thing to do, and the honest thing was increasingly uncomfortably the only kind of action she could respect in herself anymore. Ryan looked at her for a moment after she stopped speaking, and then he said, "I know. And I think you're different now." He did not say she was forgiven. He did not say the wound was healed. He said he believed people could change if they were willing to start from an honest place. It was not a clean resolution. It was better than that it was real. The firm settled into a rhythm over the following months. Celeste learned the names of people on her team, not as entries in a personnel file, but as individuals with specific minds and specific ways of working that she began to genuinely account for. She made mistakes, she always would, but they were different kinds of mistakes now. Not cruelties dressed up as standards, just errors made in good faith by someone still learning what good faith required. She was harder on herself for these than she had ever been for the old ones, which she recognized as progress of a specific kind. Diane stopped by the office once a month in the early period, partly on legal business, and partly Celeste suspected out of something that, in another context, might be called investment in an outcome. She was not warm in any conventional sense, but she was consistent. And in the world Celeste was trying to build consistency had started to feel like its own form of care. On one of these visits, Diane sat across from Celeste's desk and told her, without being asked, that the regulatory proceedings against Leonard were progressing in a way that would likely result in a full accounting. She said it the way she said most things, with precision and without decoration. Celeste thanked her. Diane nodded and moved on to the next item on her list. That was the shape of things now, and Celeste had learned to find a kind of steadiness in it. There was a morning in early spring when she arrived at the office before anyone else and stood outside the building on the sidewalk, with her coffee watching the street come alive, the way city streets do when the night shift and the morning shift briefly occupy the same few blocks. There was no car service. There was no press. There was a glass door with the firm's name printed in clean, sans serif letters, and behind it a set of offices that were functional and unimpressive and entirely hers, in the only sense that it ever actually mattered, because she had built what was inside them deliberately, with her own decisions and her own name, and nothing in there belonged to anyone who wanted to take it from her. Ryan arrived 12 minutes later. He walked up beside her on the sidewalk and stood there looking at the same street. He was carrying his own coffee, which he had bought from the place 2 blocks over, because he liked their medium roast better than what the office machine produced. He had mentioned this once, and then acted on it every day since without drama, which was exactly how he handled most things. They stood together for a few minutes without speaking, watching a delivery driver navigate a hand truck through a crowd of office workers, watching the light change at the intersection, watching the ordinary mechanics of a city that neither needed nor noticed either of them. Celeste thought about the blank check and the night she had stood in the doorway of room 14 expecting to receive something cruel, and had instead received something she still didn't have a complete vocabulary for. She thought about every version of herself that had walked into a room and believed that the only currency that mattered was the kind you could measure. She thought about all of it, and then she let it sit where it was, without trying to turn it into a lesson or a conclusion. Because some things don't need to be converted into anything. They just need to be carried forward. She turned to Ryan and said, "Thank you for the beginning of it." He glanced at her sideways, the way he did when he was deciding whether a thing needed more words than it had been given. He decided it didn't. He nodded once, and they went inside, and the morning started.